Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mary McKay. I'm the Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Initiatives, the former Dean of the Brown School, and my job is to welcome all of you today to the conversation with my colleagues at the Social Policy Institute. I'm so happy that all of you are here, and I see our numbers ticking up, so thank you all that are joining and in on our conversation. So what seems just a memory, in 2019, I had the privilege of speaking at the official launch of the Social Policy Institute. And I am so impressed with the team that McCall, you and so many others have put together to really launch a Social Policy Institute that has both local, national, and global impact. And so I'm happy to be back again to really just congratulate you on really thinking hard about what can we do from the Academy platform in collaboration with many others to bring to bear evidence-based policy solutions to some of our most pressing social challenges. And what I think SPI does really well is bring together both public and private sectors and really draw across disciplines on policy passionate leaders that want to come together and address harmful effects in our society, challenges, burdens, and really kind of do work that matters to improve our region, our nation, and our world. So what I also want to just emphasize is, and you'll hear it today in the conversation among our panelists, the emphasis on equity, the equity-centered research, equity-centered policy, equity-centered leadership that is really echoed across the Social Policy Institute, but also centered in the Washington University strategic plan. So I have the real privilege of working as part of our team with our provost that is moving forward with a university strategic plan that puts equity and a number of core values of our university at the center as we attempt to advance in research, support our people, faculty, staff, students in new ways to help them be leaders, and solve, pressing social challenges, as well as also really emphasize collaboration, particularly collaboration with our St. Louis community, and also to think globally what solutions might be brought to bear on the region and what regional solutions might influence a better nation and world. So I'm proud of the direction that our university is going in. I'm super proud of our social policy colleagues that are really in line with the future of how we need to come together. So today you'll hear from SPI's director, my colleague, McCall Grinstein-Weiss. And McCall is the Shanti K. Kanduka Distinguished Professor at the Brown School. And of course, she also directs the university-wide Social Policy Institute. What I should also tell you about McCall is she's an alum of the Brown School, and she has important collaborations, including a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So McCall, I know you're going to talk about how policies can change the trajectory of a generation, how the Social Policy Institute is working to ensure that those changes are for the good. I know you also have assembled this excellent panel of policy experts representing both local and national and global perspectives. I was happy to meet your new Associate Director of Policy and Strategies. So you'll hear from Frances Thomas, who's new to SPI, and I'm sure she's going to make an incredible difference. So I hope you all enjoy the conversation today. I hope you find your role in driving a more equitable world. McCall, thank you on behalf of Washington University. We're really, really excited to have you convene this conversation. So please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Vice Provost McKay, and for all your support of the Social Policy Institute. We are so excited to see so many individuals and alumni and parents of students here in the audience. Can I share with you a secret? Throughout my career, the title that I'm most proud to have is being an alumni of Washington University. So Vice Provost McKay shared a lot of titles, but this is the one I'm most proud to carry. I've been a graduate, as she said, of the PhD program of the Brown School. I've started my career at the University of North Carolina, and about a decade ago, I found myself back as a faculty at the Brown School, and I'm so excited about that. And I absolutely love spending time with alumni, and I'm excited to spend our afternoon together talking about topics I believe we are all passionate about as alumni, making the world a better place. So I would like to start my presentation today with a quick question. What do you think is the most important factor that influences a person's health? A poll should have popped up on your screen right now, and we will give you a moment to submit your answer. So feel free to just choose the answer you think, and soon we'll see the result of the poll. Okay. Wow, this is a smart crowd. I think the majority of the people here are chosen social and economic factors, the vast majority, 73%, which is really is the answer. And about 10% of you have said genetics, which is you really are right on kind of this trend. Usually when I ask this question or when we talk about health, the answer we're receiving is genetic. Most people think that genetic is the number one factor that determine a person's health, but in fact, genetic only account for 10% of our health, and the vast majority of our health, about 40%, is actually based on social and economic factors, just as all of you have chosen. And to show you how social and economic factors can play out in our region, where many of you went to school, send your kids to school, I want to invite you to take a quick walk with me here from Clayton, where the university is, to the Ville, a neighborhood that is just 7 miles apart. When we compare people living in Clayton to people living in the Ville, we can track the effect of inequalities throughout the life cycle. Babies born in the Ville are 6 times as likely to have a low birth rate and twice as likely to die before their first birthday compared to babies in Clayton. Looking at teens, nearly all students in Clayton will graduate from high school and go to college, compared with the Ville, where only 60% of the kids will graduate from high school and 35% will go to college. In adulthood, people living in the Ville are much more likely to be diagnosed with asthma, obesity, and diabetes. And finally, looking at life expectancy, people in Clayton live on average to the age of 85, but as you can see in this map, just moving a few miles down the road to the Ville, the average life expectancy dropped to 67. It is almost 20 years life difference for neighborhoods who are only 7 miles apart. What caused this? One of the largest impacts was a policy known as redlining. In 1916, St. Louis residents approved the nation's first racial housing segregation policy by preventing anyone from buying a home in neighborhood with more than 75% of the residents by another race. This caused significant disinvestment in Black neighborhoods in St. Louis. To try to address this problem, about 50 years ago, the Housing Choice Voucher was created to open up new housing for people by subsidizing rent rent to help individuals to move to higher opportunities area. Today, in 2020, still a third of the entire budget from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, goes toward this program. The demand for these vouchers is huge. Thousands of people are on the waiting list. And getting a voucher is like winning the lottery. But unfortunately, this program failed because most families with a voucher still move to a poor and neighborhood and segregated neighborhood. As we can clearly see in this map, as you can see, the black dots represent voucher uses, and the purple areas are predominantly Black neighborhood. This map shows that the voucher program is severely segregating St. Louis. As we saw earlier, redlining policies limited Black households from certain wealth building opportunity, so this area in purple also tend to be lower income neighborhoods that lack investment and opportunity. In fact, only 7% of families with vouchers live in high opportunity areas. Why? There is lack of affordable housing options. There is high cost associated with moving to high opportunity areas. And lastly, there is a lack of cooperation among landlords with the program and sometimes flat out discrimination, as we can see in this advertisement, specifically stating that they don't accept Section 8, which is the voucher program. So the housing discrimination in St. Louis was already bad, and the pandemic made even it worse. This further widened inequalities in St. Louis and throughout the world. Because social and economic well-being are influences of health and financial hardship, we saw the most vulnerable people during COVID experience the most significant hardship. This is a paper that we have published at the beginning of COVID, and the title says it all. What can we do about this widening inequity happening throughout the world? Social policies are a tool to solve social issues and increase social mobility. However, policies must be regularly examined and evaluated to ensure they are equitably supporting all people, especially the most vulnerable populations. That's why SPI was created. We launched the Social Policy Institute with the ultimate goal of reducing disparities in the world. The mission of the Social Policy Institute is to foster interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration to design, test, inform, and impact innovative policy solutions to reduce inequalities at the local, state, national, and global levels. We do this by conducting original research, by partnering with practitioners and policymakers to activate solutions at all levels, and developing current and emerging policy leaders. In the past 2 years, we have added infrastructure and staff to expand our work to Israel and other countries and to create international collaboration and learning opportunities. For us at SPI, most of our work starts with research, understanding where and why inequities exist. We focus our research in 4 key areas that we believe will have the most impact as we build a more equitable world: financial security, education, housing, and health. So let me share with you just a few here on the slide of the numerous projects and initiatives that we are having in SPI. So at the beginning of this presentation, I was mentioning the devastating health outcomes between mothers and children in St. Louis. One way we are working at SPI to address this is by partnering with Operation Food Surge on a project to evaluate nutrition and wraparound services to improve infant and maternal health outcomes among women experiencing food insecurity. We are also playing key role in implementing a vision to establish a first universal children's saving account policy in Israel, which was the first one in the world, actually, to provide money from the government to create a better future for all kids in the country. And during COVID, we created a panel, longitudinal panel, when we were following 5,500 families in the US, representative sample, to see the impact of COVID, and we use many strategies and outcomes to help low-income and vulnerable population to deal with the many impacts of COVID, including some of what we just discussed, which is creating a testimony for the Maryland Housing Authority about mitigating evictions and the important role that moratoriums is playing. So I believe, as Newton said, we build too many walls and not enough bridges. At SPI, we cherish this belief and build our work around partnerships and working together to achieve our goal to build equity and dismantle broken system. Chancellor Martin has taken us all to be in St. Louis, tasked us all to be in St. Louis for St. Louis, and we are partnering with local advisory committee, nonprofit, community, and other community members to inform our events, programs, and research. And of course, we work with our students here at Washington University, turning the next generation of leaders through university programs such as the Graduate Policy Scholars and our Master of Social Policy. We couldn't do any of this without our incredible funder and community collaborators. This is just a few of the many local, national, and international organizations that support our work, not to mention our advisory committee and over 75 faculty affiliates who support and inform our strategy. We could have not do this alone. Yes, equity is possible. We truly believe that. Social Policy Institute bring people to inform and support equitable policies and practices. We all have a role to play. For some of you, it might start here with learning at an event like this or engaging with programs like the one I just described. We believe equity is possible, and we hope you do too. I would like now to pass the conversation to my colleague, Fanny Thomas, Associate Director of Policy and Strategies here at SPI, to introduce our panelists.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. So before you go, I have a question for you that was actually submitted in advance by our attendees that I hope you have a moment to answer for us. So the question is, what do you think is the most important tool for influencing policy?
So I think as I just described, we at SPI really truly believe that partnership is key, that we can't do it alone and no one can do it alone, but coming all of us together, bringing the academy, bringing people on the ground, the community who can inform the issues, building bridges to industry and other corporation, nonprofit, government, local government, national government. That's the key. When you build and form this important partnership and collaboration, when you support it with evidence that we have here at the Social Policy, that we create here at the Social Policy Institute, and when you come up with a sometimes innovative solution, that's when you can achieve impact. And that's what I believe is the key.
Okay, thank you so much for setting this great foundation for our next phase of this conversation. And so now I'm going to ask our panelists to please turn on their cameras for the panel discussion portion of the event. I also, as I'm waiting for the panelists to come on, would like to remind the audience that we have a Q&A feature that you can use to submit questions directed at our panelists as we go on with this conversation. So thank you everybody for turning your cameras on. Welcome to this space, to this conversation. We are really glad to have you on this panel. And so just to cue how this section is going to go, we're going to spend a few minutes in discussion. I have a few prepared questions. And then after that, we will open it up to a Q&A from the audience using the audience questions. And so before we actually get going on the discussion, and before I give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves, I wanted to give a very special shout out to Adam Pearson, who stepped in at literally the last minute at 11 a.m. this morning to be on this panel today, because one of our other panelists could not be present today. So thank you, Adam. And I will let you get us started off by please taking a minute to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, especially as is relevant to this conversation on policy, practice, and people. So Adam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fannis. Absolutely, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm Adam Pearson. A little bit about me, my roots are in occupational therapy. I'm a community mental health practitioner who graduated from WashU School of Medicine back in 2011 in the occupational therapy program. I am a former team member of SPI, and I'm thrilled to be able to join you all today. Presently, I am the Chief Operating Officer at Peter and Paul Community Services, which is a homeless services organization. So our mission is we walk with people facing homelessness on their journey to lifelong stability. We serve around 12,000 clients each year in the region through our housing, shelter, and supportive services type programs. Policy helps us to inform expansion opportunities, what our best practices should be, and where we need to target our advocacy for our services. So I'll keep it really brief, but in short, policy determines our operations and everything we do, who we serve, how we serve, and how we're going to serve in the future.
Thank you, Adam. Nisha?
All right, hi everyone. I'm Nisha Patel, and I have a part-time affiliation as a senior fellow at the Social Policy Institute. And like several folks here, I'm also a WashU alum, proud Brown School alum way back in 98, and pleased to continue to be able to be part of the Social Policy Institute because it gives me a chance to connect with alumni, especially alumni who are interested in policy. But by day, my main day job is that I work as a philanthropic advisor based in Washington, D.C. And I have the privilege of working with a range of donors who are focused on increasing social and economic mobility through fueling policy and system change. And so I always like to keep a foot in the policy world and work to drive more resources towards social change in that way. So excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And now, Ido.
Thank you, Fannis, and thank you, Michal, for inviting me, and Vice Provost McKay. Such an honor. I've been to your campus, and I was deeply impressed. So I come to this discussion actually from a governmental point of view. I spent my entire career working for the Israeli Foreign Service. I believe that I represented a different kind of diplomacy, more interested in its social impact rather than in appearance and representation only. The main idea is that technology disrupted traditional diplomacy, and modern diplomacy is more about having an impact. My specialty became what we call place branding or place positioning. It's actually a practice, it's a methodology that places can use, whether a city, a region, a nation, to elevate their performance across the board. And by the way, doing so, also healing some social rifts and building bridges. And there are many examples of successful cases, most notably the case of Spain post-Franco 1975, elevated the entire performance of the nation of Spain. And I can give you a brief insight into how that happened.
Okay, thank you, Ido. So to get us started, every one of you has mentioned policy in your introductions. And so I think as a ground setting, something that is really important is for us and for the audience to like get an understanding of what do you mean when you say policy. So this question is for everyone, and it is, how do you define policy? And in addition to that, why is policy and policy making so important for a society, for an organization, for a corporation, and such? So I am going to start with Nisha. Will you please answer my question?
Yeah, great question. Always good to define what we're talking about. So I like to take complex concepts and simplify them. And I would say at its simplest, purest form, policy is the rules, right? The rules that are, and which rules? The rules at all levels, the rules that are put forward by government. And in the United States, that can be federal, state, and local. Certainly, there are also, transnational rules as well. I'm sure Ido can speak to some of that, or international, I should say. But it's not limited to government. Policy also has an impact at the organizational level, and businesses themselves have policies, right? Employers have policies about who they might or might not hire. And why is this important for the topic today and the work at the Social Policy Institute? It's important because all of these policies, no matter what institution or government is setting them, they determine, I should say, not just the policies, the rules, and also how they're implemented, which I think we'll get into when we talk about practice. The rules and how they are implemented on the ground are important because they determine who has access to opportunity, social and economic opportunity, and who doesn't. Like that's my fundamental sort of answer.
Thank you. Ido, same question. How do you define policy and why is it important?
Yeah, so the most common definition of what is a policy is the ability to articulate an idea, to put in a certain format so that it could be translated into execution in real life, just like what Nisha said so beautifully. I think that in modern days there is a more progressive approach to policy that looks at policy making as part of creative thinking. If you think about it, policy requires a great deal of creativity. And I can give many, many examples. And sometimes the biggest obstacle that we have in policy making, and more importantly, in the implementation of policy, is that the people who are thinking about policy are not using enough creative resources. They're being guided or condemned by the past. Many of them are hijacked by old ideas. People resist change. It's a big, big, big obstacle in policy drafting and in policy making.
I appreciate that answer very much. And Adam, what can you add? What is your definition of policy, and what else can you add to the importance of policy making on top of what Nisha and Ido have so eloquently stated?
Yes, and fantastic answers from my colleagues. Not to be this occupational therapy super advocate, but I think about participation in the community a lot. And so in my world, we work with individuals who are homeless and who have disabilities. And so when I think about policy, I think about the mechanisms by which rules are made, to get to Nisha's example, that influence how we live our daily lives. And I think through the lens of equity, policy influences who lives by what rules and how, who is going to participate and how, because as we've seen with the genesis of this nation, not everybody was supposed to fully engage in policy and in society. And so policy affects who's able to go where, who's able to own what, who's able to leverage what resources, how those resources are allocated. And so I think policy is a combination of how we structure the rules of society and then who gets to participate in society.
Adam, I like this answer, and it actually leads up very well to my next question, which is that, like if we reference back to Mikal's presentation, and the statistics that she shared around disparities in St. Louis, particularly like between DeVille and Clayton, but like St. Louis and elsewhere. So we have all these like disparities in infant birth weight and mortality, education outcomes, health, housing, which is very relevant to your work. And I think you touch on a little bit on this idea that sometimes when we share out statistics like this, and talk about disparities, people argue like, well, these differences are because like this set of people have done this thing and this set of people haven't done these things. And we really tend to focus on those like individual characteristics as the cause of these disparities, and less on like how systems and policies that have been put in place work to exclude some people from opportunity. And so I think I would love for you, Adam, to expound a little bit on the answer that you started giving in talking about like, how do we help people understand how, systemic barriers that are products of bad policies really do impact individual outcomes and, community outcomes and societal outcomes. So take it away.
Yeah, that is such a fantastic question. And thank you for Michal for setting the stage with the fantastic PowerPoint. So there is a statistic that I go back to often. And these are recent data points as of 5 and 10 years. But when we look at the average life expectancy of somebody who is homeless in the United States, it is between 42 and 52 years of age. And if I could just say that one more time, because I think it's just a really bleak statistic, the average life expectancy of somebody who is homeless in the United States is between 42 and 52 years of age. So we're talking about a reduction of what? A third of somebody's lifespan simply for the lack of housing. Michal referenced the average life expectancies in Clayton, Missouri versus DeVille, right? A 7-mile gap, and there is a dozen years difference of life expectancy there. And so I think just when I think about homelessness and the work that we do as an agency, many of our clients have mental illness and severe mental illness. And so they have that through no fault of their own. Many of them are unemployed or underemployed, and many of them are products of a system that has been highly discriminatory for employment practices and housing practices. And so when we think about the primary driver of homelessness in the city, the state, the United States, it's a lack of affordable housing. And so the fact that people are unemployed or underemployed, or they might not have a strong housing history, is endemic of a system that is not supportive of everyone. The vast majority, or the highest risk factor of individuals who are homeless are individuals who are African American and individuals who have disabilities, right? And so thinking about across the board, all of the things being equal, a lot of individuals who are minorities or have been minoritized in our society do not have equal access to housing. And because they don't have equal access to housing, that then drives those really bleak and stark health disparities, such as life expectancy. And so I think policy, the role of the political discussions really should shift towards meeting the urgent needs of people right now. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot at Peter and Paul Community Services, given the life expectancy gap, is that we don't have a lot of time, right? We are time limited. We are in a rush to provide housing and supportive services for people. The vast majority of the clients that we serve are between 35 and 55 years of age. After that, it kind of drops off because a lot of people don't make it on the streets for too long. And so I think when we talk about the role of policy in lifting people up and sort of bridging these gaps of inequity, the idea really shifts towards how can we leverage city services and local services? How can we advocate with the Board of Aldermen, with local business owners who might want to buy tax credits for low-income housing developments, for example? How can we advocate to legislators at the statewide level or even in Congress to build in some of these policies that could help to build more supportive housing, more affordable housing in the community, to at least increase the life expectancy a bit and give people a chance to actually make it in society.
Thank you, Adam. And I really appreciate that this example is, very specific to St. Louis, but also it's, like housing is a national crisis right now. And so something that is really, relevant and applicable, and something that our alumni need to know whether they stay in St. Louis or not, because this is an issue that is nationwide. And trying to expand this, this line of discussion in scope, I want to turn over to Ido and ask you, I suppose I'm also not a person who has thought about, the critical thinking aspect of policymaking in depth, and it seems to be something that you are very familiar with. So I think thinking about, this issue, whether it's housing or otherwise, thinking about systemic inequalities and systemic barriers to opportunity for individuals, I want to hear your thoughts about how you see this playing out in, in an international context, especially you live in Israel right now. I think, it's an area that some of us might not be very familiar with. So what do you have to add to Adam's, response around systemic barriers and how creative thinking in terms of policymaking can help address individual, challenges and disparities that are faced by individuals, whether in the US or in Israel, as it relates to your work?
Thank you so much. Israel is an interesting case study because Israel was founded as a socialist nation. Both my parents came from extreme poverty, and especially my mom. My mom did not finish elementary school. She went to work. My mom was born in Tel Aviv, 1932. A lot of people think of Israelis as Eastern European, but the vast majority of Israelis are like me, people from Arab countries. My mother's family is from Yemen. So at that time, the 50s, 60s, 70s, Israel, the level of social inequality was very, very low, but Israel was a very poor nation. In the 1980s, as Israel opened up to technology, to what we call the Americanization of Israel, and the introduction of the neoliberal approach, Israel became much more successful on the global stage as an economy, and most importantly, as a hub of creativity and innovation. But as a result, the gap widened. So Israel is an interesting case study. I'll be more than happy to elaborate more on the case of Israel. But to go to Adam's point, which I completely relate to, here's the obstacle. We have to consider policy, as Nisha said, the hard rules, but also soft policy. What is soft policy? I'm using the term, I'm paraphrasing on soft power from Joseph Nye. What is soft power? Is what countries do to each other in order to convince them to do something without using military force or economic sanctions, right? So right now, US sanctions on Russia are only deepening the rift between Russia and the United States. There's no chance that the sanctions will actually make them friends again, right? It's not going to happen. You can make friends by using soft elements in your arsenal, in your toolkit. In the case of the policymaker, the ability to overcome what we call information overload. Information overload is the toxicity of the conversation today. It's the main reason. Why? Because information overload eliminates nuance. It pushes people away from complexity. That's the reason for the dramatic polarization in American political system. If you may, information overload produced Brexit on one hand, and Donald Trump on the other hand. People are being bombarded by too many stimulations. They're unable to handle them because the human brain was never designed to handle so many stimulations simultaneously. And as a result, people crave for simplicity in the face of growing complexity. That's how you end up with Brexit. Doesn't matter where you stand on Brexit, whether you support Brexit or you're against Brexit, there's no question that the vast majority of the people that voted did not know what they were voting on. The idea sounded good to them, had no idea the complexity that came with it. Now, when you look at major issues where American society made progress, for example, same-sex marriage, which is today completely mainstreamed. How did it happen? Only 20 years ago, it was unheard of. That will be part of the mainstream. And the answer is a combination of soft policy, which is mostly the intervention of popular culture institutions like Hollywood, like the world of literature, like the world of music, and so on, and policymakers that took their cue from great scientists like the scientists that we have at Washington University in St. Louis. So if you ask me, that's really the winning recipe. Using soft elements, yes, there are a lot of people, on every issue, you'll find a divide today. Even issues that may seem to you like a no-brainer, right? Adam is talking about reducing the pain and the suffering of the homeless community, of the homeless people. It seems like this should be in consensus, right? No matter where you stand politically, you should be in favor of this. No, but the reality is that there's a divide around this issue as well. So there's no other way but to use information, use academic research, hard facts, as we call them, cold facts, no emotions, coupled with those softer elements. Those softer elements create an emotional connection. They create compassion. And I think that we're getting there. The Hollywood is already gearing towards that. And some of the big movies that came out, some of the shows that are coming out. Same thing is happening with the issue, with the drive to see a cashless world. We all understand that cash is a recipe for disaster. And should be a consensus, right? With cash, you will eliminate, with the cashless systems, you will eliminate a great deal of the crime that is happening. With cashless systems, you will avoid, for example, the black market. So you would think that there's going to be a consensus, but no, there's a huge divide. There's a huge fight around this issue. And again, you would need to use that winning recipe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ido, for that. And I, once again, love the segues because this segues me very nicely into a conversation that I want us to have around the influence and the need for evidence for informing policies. So, when Ido talks about soft policies and the partnership or the interaction between the being in the moment and what is happening, within the society, but also pairing that with research work that is being done, all of these things that we are learning from being very intentional about studying and evaluating policies, which is some of the work that we do here at the Social Policy Institute. And so this question is actually directed to Nisha, who happens to be a senior fellow at SPI. And the question is, why do you think evidence-based policy is so important to policymaking? And in addition to that, how can researchers and research institutes like SPI, who do very policy relevant work, tying back to Michael's presentation, you see, we do work on housing, on health, on, wealth building. And so, So the first question is, why is evidence-based policy important? And the second question is, how do researchers like ourselves who work at, big research institutes like, WashU at SPI, inform or communicate the findings of our work to make sure that we are really informing the policymakers? And also, I'm going to ask this to Adam later, but also inform the work of, policy advocacy organizations to help push these issues and the policy making that can be able to address social issues. So I'm going to start with Nisha.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Why is evidence important? So without evidence, again, to simplify it, without the facts, then we're just kind of grasping at straws, right? And then you end up with policies that often are politicized and actually are prone to really appreciate and resonate with what Ida was sharing. We're talking about changing systems, right? And what are the tools that we have? What do we know from experience that actually changes systems? Two things: changing policies and changing mindsets or changing narratives. It's a lot of what Ida was talking about. He was describing it as sort of soft policy.
Hearts and minds.
Right, hearts and minds, and facts alone, as Ida was saying, don't do that. So evidence is super important. So let me start with your question, so that we're basing, in fact, like, does a program work? Or does just some politician think it's a great idea because it's going to drive resources to their community or their district or their pet program? So we want to know that the policies and then the programs, often policy is a mechanism for funding programs and practices on the ground. We want to know they're actually having their intended impact. But I would actually like to push all of us and push the audience, and particularly folks who are working in kind of traditional research fields, to kind of open the apertures in the way that they think about evidence. Yes, absolutely, things like RCTs, randomized control trials, have their place. But that is often, as the researchers on this call in the audience know, that is often long-term work and only lends itself to specific types of program models or interventions. We also need to couple some of those traditional research methods with feedback from folks who are most impacted, and center the folks who are impacted by the policy and be asking of them the question: you're closest to the challenge. This challenge is affecting you. What do you see as the solutions? And is this program actually doing what it was intended to do, right? And very often we find when we ask those questions, the answer is no. And part of the reason for that is, as we are developing programs to then maybe a great researcher at SPI will evaluate. Well, fundamentally, as that program was designed, were people whose lives were impacted informing the design of that program? Or were we simply looking at traditional data and evidence and saying, oh, well, we see this. Let's talk to somebody. And yes, we have some of those at WashU. Let's talk to some of the best PhD researchers and roll something out based on paper? Or are we pausing and saying, well, hang on a second, let's talk to the folks whose lives will be impacted, use that feedback to inform the program design, but all along the way have those checkpoints from folks that are impacted to test out that this speaks to what I was saying at the beginning around policy and implementation. Sounds like a good idea on paper, but how is it being implemented? And what you find, particularly in a place like the United States, when you have federal policy that has a lot of variation in the way it's implemented on the ground, you see very different kinds of impacts. And we're an incredibly diverse nation. And so we have to take into account, okay, we've got evidence that says this worked, but at what time period and for whom? If that evidence is from 20 years ago, the social, political, economic, the labor market has changed dramatically. And so we need to always be rechecking that evidence to say, is that evidence still relevant?
Yes. And I saw Adam just like nodding away and agreeing with everything as you were going. And so I would love to give you an opportunity to contribute and extend what Nisha, to Nisha's response, but also like as somebody who works for an advocacy for an organization that does advocacy work, I really would love to hear your input around, how do researchers like partner with advocacy organizations to make sure that, this evidence that we are generating, hopefully in the best ways, like Nisha has illustrated, is being used for policymaking.
Absolutely. And so there were a couple of things that resonated a bit, this idea of hearts and minds, right? So in homeless services, I think, Edu alluded to this earlier, nobody wants more homelessness, right? You can ask anybody on the streets, rich or poor, Black or white, it doesn't matter. Do you want to see more homelessness or less homelessness in our community? Nobody's going to want to say more homelessness, right? And so the question then is, okay, well, we're on the same page about that. So how do we move towards a solution for that? And I think that's the trick, right? So when we were, so Peter and Paul has 6 different programs. 4 of them are housing and shelter programs. One of them is a program that I helped to lift off the ground as director years ago in 2014 called Garfield Place Apartments. And so the idea with apartments was that we wanted to build a permanent supportive housing development for individuals with severe mental illness and substance use disorder, et cetera, et cetera. And so the neighborhoods that we were looking at by and large were, mostly supportive of the endeavor because they knew that we would have staffing in the building 24/7 and perhaps a security team, and people would be engaged in social services and all of this stuff. And so one of the pieces of feedback that I got when we were connecting with the community is that some people were really nervous about it because they thought that we would be bringing in homelessness into their neighborhoods. One of the talking points that we used, and I use the word talking point lightly here, but one of the proof points that we use is that no, homelessness is already here. It's here right now. We just want to house people formally. The next bit of that was thinking through what message resonates with people who are a little bit on the fence about this type of programming. And so hearts and minds, thinking through what sort of messaging works for different people. Some people really like the idea of, housing for everybody is fair, it is equitable, it is ethical. We need to guarantee housing for everybody because they have really big hearts. Some people say, well, all that sounds good, but what does it mean for the bottom line? Or what does it mean for the cost of programming in society? And so you look at some of the data points and some of the evidence from that time. And there was a study that came out of New York City a long time ago. This was, I think, in the Obama administration. But they looked at the amount of money that New York spent to keep somebody on the streets, to keep them homeless and for a year. And so it came out to be between primary costs like operating shelters, secondary costs like operating emergency departments because people tended to hang out in emergency departments, the cost for prison cells and all of that. That came out to around $40,000 per year per homeless individual. So the taxpayers were shelling that out each year for all of these individuals in New York City. You look at some other studies, when you plug those individuals into supportive housing and get them the housing that they need, social work, occupational therapy, substance use counseling, all of that, that cost decreases to the $30,000 mark or maybe in the $20,000 mark. And so for those who are fiscally minded, the proof is in the money. It's on the bottom line. And so that's sort of the talking point that resonates with them. I think for the second part of the question, actually, what was the second part of the question? I got really excited.
No, it's okay. I try to avoid asking multi-part questions because at some point people forget, but then sometimes it's easy to just let people answer both of them at the same time. All that said, the second part of the question was, how can researchers, so for example, you've been at SPI, you know the wonderful work that we do here. It's very relevant for policy making, right? And I think sometimes, even just within SPI, but like researchers in general, we have such a hard time thinking about how to like translate that and communicate that to policymakers or policy advocacy organizations. So really the question is like, how do we best as researchers translate and communicate this work that we have, these findings that we have, to help an organization like Peter and Paul that does advocacy work do that advocacy, or communicate directly to policymakers. And I think Nisha handled the policymaker part, which you can add to, but I really would love to hear from somebody who works at an advocacy organization, what is the best avenue for researchers to communicate these findings to you, to help you do your advocacy work?
Yeah, I think of a couple of different ways that we could, share information and exchange ideas that could support policymakers' decisions and strategies. And so I think one approach is by sharing the stories, the lived experience. And so policymakers in an ideal world are beholden to their constituents. They want to know what their constituents' day-to-day lives are, what they struggle with. What are some of the pain points, as a lot of folks say in business. And so if we can share stories with the policymakers, real world stories about how people are struggling and what sort of supports that they need, that could sort of speak to some of those real world anecdotes that lawmakers could use to say, well, you know what, the programming as we have it right now, fiscally, it might be working okay, but programmatically, I think there's still some people being left behind, as evidenced by X, Y, and Z. So I think we can tell those stories to policymakers. I think secondly, something that I believe your DSSI initiatives has been talking about is leveraging data to really tell the story. So there's a qualitative piece about the lived experience, but then there's another aspect, and that's working with organizations to help build their data capacity and to help them tell a story quantitatively and with numbers and with hard facts. And so that's something that may resonate with researchers as well. So Peter and Paul, for example, we are in the process of building and finalizing this data platform and training everybody in our agency on how to use this outcomes tracking platform that frontline staff use, directors, the development team, the CEO. And so all of us will have access to demographic data so we can be better advocates for the work that we do. But we can also share this information in the future with universities who might be doing research studies, assuming that the clients are okay with us sharing that information. And so the data that we have in the aggregate could be used for randomized control trials, perhaps, or case studies, or white pages, or white papers, yellow papers. And so there's some advocacy and work to be done on that end at the agency level to build the data platform to make sure that we're collecting the information that we need to collect to improve our services, but then also use that data to then partner with universities who have more capacity to do some of that research and more capacity to build a research team and come in with the knowledge and the expertise needed to actually create research studies and ask good research questions.
Okay, thank you. And I want to pause here for a moment to queue up for the audience that we are about to wrap the panel discussion portion up in a few minutes and invite you to submit questions to the Q&A, and we will shift on over to those very shortly. This is sort of my wrap-up question, and I think one of the things that is present in this panel that I really appreciate is the fact that Nisha works in philanthropy, Adam works in like a nonprofit, Ido has lots of experience from like the government side of policymaking. And so this is a question that, I think it kind of goes back to my first question, second question maybe, but it's about, when we think about social issues and we think like, well, that's an individual problem, it's, it's like because of individual choice, and we don't really look at the system. And I think from the like addressing issues, sometimes we think like, well, that is not the role of the government, right? Like philanthropy can handle that, or, the social services sector can handle that, and like that's not the purview of the government. And so my question for all three of you, and I'm going to start with Ido on answering it, is like, what do you see as some of the challenges of relying on like nonprofits, charitable programming, philanthropy, or even for-profit organizations to be the solution makers to addressing these social issues that really should be solved through policy makings? So like, what are some of the challenges, and how do we, sorry, it's a two-part question again, but the second part is like, how do we, force is like the wrong word, right? But how do we make policymakers really own these issues, right? Because like, I think everybody on this panel can say like, no, that is not an issue that, housing is not an issue that philanthropy or, you know, the social services sector or the nonprofits should be solving, right? But how do we really like make policymakers understand that that is the work of the policymakers rather than these organizations? So Ido, I'll start with you. Ido, you're on mute.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, I spent my career basically working with decision makers on a national level. I was exposed to the work of, you know, American presidents and the European leaders and so on, and I've seen them up close. And I can tell you two things. First, your first question, the danger is that if you rely too much on the, I don't like the term not-for-profit, I like to call it for-purpose organizations.
I like that.
And if you rely on them, there are two dangers here. First of all, they don't have enough resources. And secondly, is a danger that the government or whoever is making the central element that is making the decisions basically will feel that, you know, they're relieved of the duty to do anything. And you see that a lot now with the whole discussion about Bill Gates and his role trying to talk about pandemics. And he already delivered a major speech on this issue in 2015. And so there's a tendency of people say, you know what, Bill Gates, you know, you deal with it. You have the resources. That's a big danger. The second thing is that sometimes those for-purpose organizations don't have the big picture. And they don't have the big picture because they don't have the funds to conduct thorough research that will give them a good grip as to the context, because the homelessness problem in St. Louis, I don't know, I'm assuming, is different than the homelessness problem in Los Angeles.
That's right.
And you need to have the big picture in order to, so that's as for your first question. The second question, there's always a clash between policy and strategy. Why? Especially in politics. Why? Because the decision maker is interested in short-term gains. They're interested in, especially again, the political decision maker, but also the corporate decision maker. They're interested in credit. They're fighting each other over credit. And strategy is not something they like, because strategy is working in light of an overarching principle that will affect reality maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now. I'm not in that business. I want a report in the local paper tomorrow morning. I want to see, I want to upload a picture on my Instagram account immediately. I'm not interested in waiting. So there's a clash. How do you resolve that clash between strategy? And I can tell you how I did it myself, because I started what is known as the Brand Israel program that was meant to elevate the performance of Israel in tourism and investment, in exchange students, for example, which we failed miserably. But in tourism, for example, we went from 500,000 tourists when we started to 5 million. That's a dramatic increase, right? How did we do that? How did I do that? By using a great deal of psychology. I had to convince 5 different Israeli governments to invest their attention and energy in the effort to elevate the performance of Israel as a brand. Just as I think St. Louis can do elevating its performance. It is possible. So how did I do that? I came up with an acronym that anyone can relate to, called RSWIM. Those 5 letters stand for 5 terms that are basic: research, strategy, work plan, implementation, measurement. Research, of course, is a must, and you have to own the research. One of the ways to get them to convince the decision makers to invest money in research is to tell them, it's going to be yours. You will own it, right? Strategy is the heart of the program, is the heart of the how do I articulate the long-term strategy, the long-term plan? Where would I like to be? I was asked by the government of Sri Lanka to help them with an effort to brand themselves as an island of ingenuity, and they already told me that before I bid in the tender, they already agreed with no research that this is going to be their strategy, an island of ingenuity. And I told them this is a typical governmental mistake, because what you're doing is you're announcing something that you're not. You're not an island of ingenuity. Maybe one day you will become, thank God. But right now, you're not an island of ingenuity. And so I told them I'm not going to take the job. But it's just an example of how decision makers think. Strategy is the heart of the process. And then how do you translate the strategy into actionable and affordable? That's a key. A lot of people have ideas, great ideas. Those ideas cost a lot of money. But so your work plan has to evolve from your strategic idea, but represent something that is well rooted in your budgetary realities. That's a key to the success of the work plan. Then you oversee the implementation, and then you go back to research because you need to measure your effectiveness. It's a cyclical process. I call it RSWIM. And when you present it that way, and obviously in the academic world, you have access to the research, you have the ability to come up with an effective strategy. I can give you many examples of places that came up with incredibly creative strategies that saved them. Look at the story of New York City. New York City in the early 1970s was on the verge of bankruptcy. They didn't have money to pay salaries to the employees, to the police officers. The place was known for police corruption and crime and poverty, and it bounced back. And the reason why it happened is because they had a strategy in place. They knew where they want to see the city 20 years from now. And part of that strategy, for example, was to build Lower Manhattan. Up until that time, Columbia University was considered to be the main academic institution in New York. Today, you have NYU in downtown Manhattan, which is a balancing act to Columbia University. And just one tiny example, and I could give you many other examples like that. But that's really the answer to your question. You need to be able to package those ideas for them and remember their psychology. They're interested in short-term gains. I don't want to use the term narcissism, but in many cases, you are dealing with people that are malignantly narcissistic. It's a huge problem, huge. And people like us, in my case, diplomats, part of our training must be to learn how to deal with personalities like that. Self-absorbed, self-centered, interested in attention, in public relations, and not interested really in solving problems long-term.
Thank you. Nisha, I would love for you to chime in on this conversation.
Yeah, so I am someone in my career, most of my work now is in philanthropy, but I have worked across different sectors. And it's interesting just listening to my co-panelists here. So early in my career, I actually worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And at the time when I worked there, I had come from working from a scrappy local grassroots foundation here in DC, moved out to Seattle, started working for this global organization. And I thought, wow, as an individual program officer, my individual portfolio was $25 million. At the time, I thought that was a lot of money. And at that time, the Gates Foundation's annual giving was about $3 billion. It's much more than that now. It's a whole lot of money to me, and it is a whole lot of money. But one thing that was always emphasized there was it's a philanthropy it's fairly unique in its size and that is pretty obsessed with scale, which is different than most of philanthropy. Most of philanthropy is much smaller scale. And later in my career, after I left the Gates Foundation, I was fortunate to be a political appointee in the Obama administration. And that's where that role really drove home for me what a drop in the bucket philanthropy is. Because then, as director of the Office of Family Assistance at the US Department of Health and Human Services, I managed an annual budget that was $17 billion in one office within one department. And that's when you really start to see that philanthropy is a drop in the bucket. And so I have very, very clear points of view that I have developed over the course of my career about the role of philanthropy, the role of grassroots nonprofits, advocates versus government. And because I work, you asked specifically about philanthropy. To me, philanthropy is the innovation capital of the social sector. Philanthropy should be taking more risks, should be funding new ideas, new projects. And not to say government can't do that as well, but that is a core purpose of philanthropy and help to build some of that evidence. So then when we get to the place where then advocates are doing their work to say, hey, this is working in my community, government should be supporting this at larger scale, we've got evidence to point to say that this works. And that's when you're dealing with public dollars, I do think there should be a higher standard of evidence. You've got a proof of concept, but then you want to scale it. And I'll give you a concrete example. So in my practice, I work with a number of philanthropists that fund in the guaranteed income space. So they're funding guaranteed income projects around the country for folks, particularly folks, people of color, other folks who have been traditionally, systemically locked out of economic opportunity in this country, can receive direct cash payments. And you know what? We've got all kinds of evidence that works in terms of all the things you'd want to measure related to social and economic mobility, including, beyond just the economic, the sort of the belonging piece, the well-being piece, the social connection piece. And you know what? In those pilot programs that philanthropy funds, it's great for those 200 households that get access to those payments. But it's nowhere near the scale of folks that could be benefiting. And that's where government comes in. So I'd contrast that with the evidence that we now have, which SPI has actually been on the forefront of evaluating, which is the impact of the expanded child tax credit policy that we had in this country over this past year. Many other countries like Israel and other places around the world have child benefits. It's not something that we have universally. But we implemented just for 1 year direct cash payments to almost all. The vast majority of children in this country and their parents received $250 to $300 a month over the course of a 6-month period last year. That did more to reduce child poverty than any other policy in my 25-year career. And now we've got great evidence, analysis from SPI, from Columbia and other research institutions showing that this worked. Massive scale, right? Philanthropy alone cannot do that. But philanthropy over years has been funding pilot programs, research to generate the evidence that when there was a policy window, there was a crisis, there was an opportunity to move something, we could go to, and so your second part of your question was, how do you convince policymakers? And this is where the sectors have to work together. It's being able to say, you've got to make a decision. You've got like a couple of weeks to figure out, like in a crisis, a national emergency response. Here's the evidence. We're ready to serve it up. We've been waiting. We've got it in our hands and we're ready to hand it to you. And we can point to programs around the country that are showing that this works. Push it forward. And they did. Unfortunately, that was not extended. I hope that we have a chance to do that in the months and years ahead.
I really, really hope so. And I appreciate you highlighting the work of the CTC, which if anybody is on the call and is interested in learning more about that work, I hope that Jenna is able to drop a link to the SPI CTC work in the chat. And if not, if you get in touch with us, we will definitely send you that information out. So Adam, with a few minutes to go before we go into the Q&A, I would love for you to also answer this question, especially as somebody who works at a local nonprofit organization. And to reiterate my question, it is, what is the danger of relying on what Ido has very wonderfully termed for-purpose organizations to be the solution for social problems, and how do we help convince policymakers to be the ones who take on the solving of these problems?
Absolutely. I mean, my colleagues have given some phenomenal responses. I think from the perspective of somebody who is currently in the community, when we think about, there are approximately 3 million individuals nationwide who experience homelessness throughout the course of the year. At any given time, there are around 600,000 individuals who are currently experiencing homelessness. And so the amount of housing that we need to safely provide consistent, affordable housing to everybody is something that Peter and Paul cannot do. And so, we have, we're a $4 million agency. Even if you pooled all of the resources nationwide of all of us homeless services agencies, we don't have the capacity and the funding to immediately meet that need. And so I think, Nisha talked about scale. The federal government, state governments have this bully pulpit, essentially, where there is a lot of infrastructure. Now, granted, some of it is not as well funded as it could be. The government, at least the state government, local governments tend to be a little bit short on staff sometimes. But as far as the revenue, some of these governments have the ability to allocate an enormous amount of money over short periods of time to organizations that could help solve the problem. And so if you're relying on organizations like Peter and Paul to scale overnight and meet this need, we're going to need a lot of help. And the help that we need is through massive influxes of cash. Often the private sector donors and philanthropists may not be able to meet that need. And so we would need support from the government, federal, statewide, whatever, to help us scale adequately enough to make sure that folks are housed. And that's just one example. And I think for lawmakers, they're elected to do a job and we're paying their salaries. And so part of the work of a lawmaker is solving problems. And so if you are going to run for office and spend all of this ridiculous amounts of cash to run for office and be elected as an official, do the work, right? I mean, your constituents are relying on you to solve very difficult problems. In our, in our system of government, we elect people and put them into positions so that they can make very difficult decisions. And so it is incumbent upon them to sort of step up and say, you know what, maybe I am very conservative, but we have a role as a government to sort of step in and relieve some sort of pressure on people. Or maybe I really hate spending money as an elected official, but what we're doing right now is clearly not working and is driving up costs by not actually solving the problem. So let's think about what we could do as lawmakers to help solve this problem. So I think that's the best response that I can give, is a matter of scale and then a matter of elected officials literally being charged with doing the difficult work of solving problems for their constituents.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you everybody for attending and listening to our panelists speak. We have just a few minutes to go and we have 2 questions in the Q&A to get through. And I'm going to actually start with the first one for Adam, because I think it lends itself very well to what you are saying about policymakers being beholden to their constituents. And so the question is, how do individuals not working in policy still make a positive impact, especially with regards to topics that they care about?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways. And I mean, just to be brief, reaching out to lawmakers and elected officials, getting active on social media, in a lot of locales, there are opportunities to get engaged via small bits of activism, whether it is a march, whether it is collecting signatures for a cause, whether it is, getting people together for, a luncheon and talking about an issue and having it be like an issues focused luncheon. Calling nonprofits or organizations that are doing the work that you're really passionate about and going on a tour and just figuring out how those organizations work, and then becoming an advocate and a cheerleader for those organizations. And so I think for people who are not currently lawmakers or policymakers, there are some low cost, low barrier ways to sort of get your foot in the door as far as how to advocate. So I think that would be a couple of good starting points.
Thank you. Ido or Nisha, anybody want to add something to what Adam said?
I will just maybe reiterate sort of what Adam said, but I love acronyms, so I loved Ido's our swim. So this is not an acronym, but it's sort of like 4 ways that people can get engaged who maybe don't work on policy, from maybe what I think is lightest lift to heavier lift, which I think of it as vote, email, call, visit, right? So vote, 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 vote. But you got to do that. The call piece, 2 numbers that everyone should have on their phone, and if you don't, it's okay, you can Google them, which is 202-224-3121, which is the Capitol switchboard at the Senate, or 202-225-3121, which is the House side. Anybody in the United States can call that number, or around the world for that matter. You can call that number and get connected to your representative and share your point of view, share your feedback on what they're voting, not voting for, what you'd like to see happen. And yes, for folks that are not old school like me, you can also go online. Most elected officials have a website where there's an easy button for that. You can go online and you can submit your information that way. And of course, you can also send an old school letter. But visit. If you're not in DC like I am, where we actually don't have representation, voting representation in Congress for folks in all other states around the country, you can visit in DC, or you can set up a visit in your local, your elected representative's district office. And now with, we're all on Zoom, there are ways to do that as well. And so you do not have to be a professional policy analyst or policy wonk to make your voice heard. So I definitely encourage everyone to do it.
Yeah, I'll just add to that today beyond the obviously the avenues that are available for people to participate politically and influence politically, we also have the rise of what we call participatory culture. There's a whole culture that encourages people to create and co-create and produce content, and that content has influence. I'll give you just one little example. If you remember during the high days of COVID in New York City, when people felt that the city will never be the same, a fellow by the name of James Altucher, who is an owner of a comedy club in New York, posted a long post, and again, based on evidence, research, he did his own research, that said New York is dead forever. And he backed his argument with data, with science, supposedly. But the point is not the fact that he, whether he was right or wrong. Obviously, he was wrong. But it sparked a public debate that is going to be remembered in the annals of the history of the city of New York. Jerry Seinfeld responded in an emotional op-ed piece in the New York Times to a LinkedIn post. Which I'm using this as an example to show you how one ordinary person has a power to spark an entire debate and bring an issue to the level of public awareness. So I totally agree with my colleagues.
Okay, so rapid fire round. You only have 1 minute to answer this question. You cannot go over a minute. Which is, or preferably less, because we have 5 minutes to go. What is the most impactful piece of policy you have seen during your career, and why? Adam.
Oh, wow. This is really hard. 1 minute. Okay. I don't know.
It can be internal or it can be external. So it can be within your organization or it can be, within government. If that
if you want a breather, Adam, I've got one right off.
Go,
Okay.
please,
It's
go.
because it's the one I already shared, which is the expanded advanced child's tax credit this last year. It did more to cut child poverty than any other policy in my career and many policies before them.
Awesome.
I'll say I have one, McKinney-Vento Act, the Hearth Act. So any homeless services legislation nationwide that help to support continuum of care, and so local organizations around the nation in solving homelessness locally.
Either.
I'll give you 3 examples. All of them I think are brilliant. The French government's decision in the late 1960s, early 1970s to support local filmmakers created the French New Wave that changed the history of cinema forever, including American film, by the way. Second, Israel, we don't have homelessness in Israel. And the reason is because the government made a policy decision years ago to give rights, especially air rights, to buildings in poor neighborhoods. So just by making that decision, they turned the people that own apartments that were worth very little before, they turned them into wealthy people on paper. And lastly, Israeli governmental decision that was made about 50 years ago to seed startup companies in technology. Small amounts, $50,000, $75,000. People that had ideas were encouraged by the government to apply for a grant, and that grant turned Israel into the second largest hub of innovation after Silicon Valley in the world. We have 10,000 active startups in Israel today, thanks to that policy enacted 45, 50 years ago.
All right. Well, thank you so much, especially for doing rapid fire round, but for the wonderful conversation throughout. And I really grateful for all of you taking time to be with us today. I hope that everybody who was in attendance enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. And now I would love to cede this over to Nicole for closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Wow, what an incredible conversation. I certainly feel inspired by the conversation and to see so many people in the room and hear all our amazing panelists. And Adam, thank you so much for joining kind of in the last minute. This conversation has really demonstrated how important it is to constantly examine policies to ensure that they are supporting equity and giving people a real chance. And it's demonstrated the power of partnerships. We cannot do this alone. That's where you are coming in. Policies are made by people. So let's get to work. All our great panelists gave so many examples. Let me give you some of my own. Identify and reach out to work with partner who is coming from a different sector. I think we really believe at SPI that the cross sector is so important. Find out what you're most passionate about and pursue it with all your heart. We mentioned heart many times today in the conversation. Get involved with your community, join an advisory board, volunteer for an issue you're passionate about. Continue learning about policies at the local, state, national, and global levels. And my most favorite one, engage with SPI. Sign up for our newsletter, participate in our events, partner with us on research, or invite us to present our work, or come up with any other way you would like to be a part of SPI. We're looking to expand our team and our family. And you are important to this work. So I hope you all enjoyed the conversation today as much as I did. Please reach out to us if you have any more questions, and thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.